Welcome back to Studio Z. We're actually here in the original studio, and today I'm joined by a gentleman called Yuval Neeman. I know Yuval as an investor, which is how we met. It's actually, full disclosure, as an investor in Zuplo. But it turns out Yuval spent a long time working at Microsoft. I'm going to let you give your background and introduction in a moment. But really exciting to me because I was such a fanboy of the stuff Yuval was working on in my early career, learning .NET, writing VB script and using Visual into Dev. These are all cool things that Yuval worked on. So today we're going to learn a little bit more about Yuval's history at Microsoft, some of the backstory there. We may even get into a little bit of culture. But Yuval, welcome to Studio Z.
Thank you. It's great to be here, Josh.
Thanks.
In kind of the Zuplo studio.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
So I think first thing, give us a bit of background on yourself. Let's do a brief resume, the story of your career.
I'll start actually. So I grew up in Israel. I actually grew up in a small community, a kibbutz. It's an agriculture community. As a kid, I kind of worked picking avocados and chickens and all of that.
Okay.
Then did my military service, which will come later because I was an officer. At age 20, I was kind of in charge of an artillery battery, 50 people. My first management experience. Then went to school. I actually started, university at age 23, and was the first time I coded. I didn't know what I wanted to study, and somebody said, go to electrical engineering because then if you want to transfer anywhere, it's easier. I did. First semester, there was introduction to programming, and I knew and by the second week, I knew that that's what I wanted to do. Fortunately, the EE department, CS, had a joint program, computer engineering. Did that and, started working and, 2 years into it.
What language were you coding in then?
That semester was the last semester in the Technion in Israel, which is the premier engineering school. We did that in PL1 on an IBM mainframe using cards. That was the last semester. They canned it after that, but my first programming experience was using those freaking punch cards.
It's kind of hard to see why you got excited about that, I guess, almost, but different time, right?
It was the programming. It wasn't the media. I guess we're doing Pascal and God, and I learned all kinds of languages. Did you know this language APL that IBM is in this mainframe? It's very concise. They had keys for functions, and anyway, it was a mathematical, all kinds of programming language. Anyway, loved doing it. Hardly spent any time in the classes. Mostly just spent time coding. Worked for a few years in Israel. Did all kinds of I'm not going to get into that. There's just too much. And then was recruited by Microsoft and ended up coming here in 1989.
Okay.
So just for reference, when I came here, Microsoft had 3,500 people.
Wow.
89 was the last year Microsoft revenue was below $1 billion.
Okay.
DOS was still the main product.
Yeah.
And just briefly on my career at Microsoft, started an engineer, worked on LAN Manager, which was Microsoft networking product, competing with NetWare, which was the big networking product at the time. Wasn't actually very successful competing with NetWare, but typical Microsoft, it got folded into the operating system, NT, and then Windows, and so forth. So I ended up moving into this project that was going to be the next generation operating system for Microsoft called Cairo. I don't know if a lot of people have heard about it. It was all kind of future stuff, trying to do distributed networking and user interface.
This is not the same as Midori or whatever Eric Rudder was running for a while.
No, this is way before. This is early 90s. But there were too many people who were thinking high thoughts and not enough people building anything. So after a year and a half where the ship date was still 2 years out, I said, I've had enough. And some buddies told me that they're looking for somebody to run an engineering team in the developer group. It was called the tools group.
Okay.
And at the time, culturally at Microsoft, there were two main division and main cultures. There was the OS group, the systems group, doing all the OS stuff, brash, aggressive, cowboys. And then there was the apps group, who were organized, ship on time, work well together, very different cultures. And the tools group was kind of a little bit of a in between. So moved there, first led the development of FoxPro, which was a fun experience. FoxPro has been acquired just shortly before that.
I got to give a call out to a guy called Paul West. Paul, you're watching this. I worked with him at Microsoft UK back in the day, and everyone makes fun of him for being a FoxPro fan. So I met the guy here.
There were no more diehard fans of any programming environment than FoxPro. The people who loved it, it was amazing. After a year and a half, moved to VB, and it was interesting because I was the dev manager. The guy who led program management was Eric Rudder.
Okay. Okay.
So I was running engineering team. This is 1995 of 20 people. By the year 2000, I lead the developer division, over 1,400 people under me.
The famous DevDiv, yeah.
Yeah, and it was it was when DevDiv was born, in fact. So I kind of had a hand in forming it. Did that, got the first version of .NET and C# and all that, and we'll talk more about that.
Wow.
And then kind of, I guess I was burned out. It was also like I was getting too far away from like product and people, and it was a little bit more politics, which I didn't particularly like. So I moved to do some other stuff. Bob Maglia was just starting some new businesses in security and storage, and I kind of went to work in storage, but it was not nearly as exciting or interesting. So after another year, I left Microsoft. I had no idea what it was going to do. I took some time off, started working with a bunch of startups here in Israel. One of those Israeli startups, we raised money from this outfit in Bellevue called Trilogy. I didn't know any of those guys. They ended up writing a check. I got to know those people, really liked them. They just formed a couple of years earlier, or a year before, a bunch of folks who had built some of the carriers we know today, kind of most notably T-Mobile is a company they started from scratch,
right.
Sold it to Deutsche Telekom. So ended up joining Trilogy in 2008 and has been doing it since then. And
that's how we met, yeah.
That's awesome. How we met. And Zuplo is kind of one of the latest investments, I've led at Trilogy. So there you go. That's
awesome. And you sit on our board as well. So, I mean, that is, to me, that is a very exciting background. I know I just know there's such a sort of, what's the word? Fandom, I think, around some of these things you worked on, not just the FoxPro stuff with Paul, but, particularly the .NET, the stories there, and some of the legends that emerged out of it. People like, the most notable, you look a little bit like today in your red shirt, is, Scott Guthrie, who I think was like a junior PM in your organization,
exactly.
right?
That's right. We'll get to it.
Okay. So I think you should just take us back. Like, tell us the story.
So before I get into the story, just a little bit of the lay of the land. So I'll go back to 1990. So the 90s really was the year that the decade that the world went from hardly anyone has computers and email and internet to by 2000, the majority of people in the US or in developing countries had all those things. And it was also the decade of Windows. Windows 3.0, which was the first real Windows, worth its salt, it shipped in 1990. And so, so just for comparison, Microsoft revenue, in 90 was just over $1 billion. By 2000, it was like over $23 billion. Just think about PC penetration. I found this statistics in 1990, 15% household penetration of PCs in the US was 15%. By 2000, it was over 50%.
Wow.
So it was huge growth. So Microsoft was transitioning the world. The PC world was growing in leaps and bounds, doubling almost every year, and transitioning from DOS, which we're not going to get into Windows, it was Windows 3. But really where Windows really got cemented, Windows 95 was the first 32-bit multitasking, virtual memory, fully powered operating system, right? And interestingly and importantly, it was also the first operating system that had a TCP/IP stack built in. So think about the internet starting around in 94, Netscape Navigator came out, and that was, for many people, the beginning of the internet, right? You could actually have a browser. But until then, if you use, Windows or DOS or Mac, you had to go buy a TCP/IP stack and all kinds of compatibility. It was a nightmare. So it's just standardized, and now, that's kind of a commodity. And the majority of Netscape Navigator was running, of users were running on Windows 95 because Windows had like 90+% market share. Mac was like 2 or 3%. And in terms of dev tools, in the early 90s, we had competition. Borland was a small company in the Bay Area with fantastic products. They had Delphi, they had the best C++ compiler back then. But by this time, after 95, so Windows 95 ships, and then Office 97 was really the first true Office release that was fully powered on top of Windows 95. And Microsoft just won the desktop, by a mile.
Yeah.
And in terms of dev tools, we had shipped kind of our version 6, VP6, Visual C++ 6, again, just completely dominating the dev tools, but it was all about developing for the applications for the desktop. This was the client server world. So a lot of enterprise applications was a VB GUI with some business logic connecting to a database. Right, that was the client-server architecture.
Yeah.
And so in C++, you could do whatever you wanted with C++, but kind of the main part of it was MFC, which was how do you create a Windows application, right? So it's all about creating Windows desktop applications. And then the internet, started to really take off. Microsoft kind of woke up. There was an important internet that is the net tidal wave, whatever, that I think it was people like Jay Allard and Steve Sinofsky got Bill's attention. Finally, Bill got everybody is like, okay, the internet is the big thing, but we're going to do it our way or whatever. There was always the threat that the internet will take away from the dominance of Windows. If you run every application in a browser, then what do you need?
Yeah, it's cross-platform by design, right? Almost,
exactly.
Yeah.
In terms of development tools, here's the other thing that happened. So we had these two main tools. C++, you could do whatever you want, but gosh, you have to deal with resource management. And like half your code is just, allocating and releasing, memories. And in all the code path, you have to release it. And,
Turns out it was a risky business from a security perspective as well.
Right? Node CrowdStrike, just recently. But also it means developer productivity, it was hard to write good C++ programs. It was, and it took a long time. And then there was VB, which made it super easy to build Windows applications. And you were way more productive. And you also didn't need to be a rocket science, but it was limited. Whatever was provided in the box was great, and there was some extensibility mechanisms. But once you're kind of outside the walls, it's not as productive.
Yeah.
And then around I think 96, Java comes out.
Okay. And
we thought that Java was kind of right in that sweet spot. It was. A managed kind of environment. You didn't have to deal with deallocating resources and all of that.
Yeah.
But it was object-oriented. It has kind of a more modern language than BASIC.
Yeah.
And we thought that was actually a really, really kind of the best kind of developer productivity versus performance and power.
It's the right trade-off, like sitting right in the
exactly.
middle.
So
wait a minute. So obviously, Java was garbage collected, right?
Exactly.
Was Visual Basic garbage collected, or some magical?
It was some magical stuff, but there were lots of. So it was a higher level abstraction than Java. But it lacked some of the power.
I mean, it was basic, right? It was the basic language with a bit of bolt-ons.
It wasn't really, object-oriented. I mean, it had object, but no inheritance.
Yeah.
So it had lots of limitations in that way. And it was kind of like, if you're a real developer, you use C++. If you were like, an enterprise developer, maybe somebody with, 2-year degree or something, and there were many of them, Just a word on the developer population at the time. We had these surveys going out every 3 months. In the late 90s into the early 2000s, the developer population in the world was around 3.25 million and not really growing much. Fast forward today, it's about 25 million, almost an order of magnitude more. in those days, it wasn't growing that much. And we divided the developer population into three categories. There were the ISVs, people who are basically developing applications for many other people to use, right, for other customers. And then there were enterprise customers, people who worked for Bank of America or insurance company developing applications, either internal applications or application just for the bank's customer. And then there was all the SI integrators consultant who basically were the same as the enterprise guys, except they didn't work for the enterprise. They were paid by the enterprise. But they were the same kind of developer. And these were typically less sophisticated developers. And that was the target for VB. So by the late 90s, VB was the most widely used developer language and environment. Primarily, if you went at that time to any large enterprise, they would have hundreds of VB applications, mostly forms-based, connecting to databases.
Yeah.
All of your small HR apps, so the sales, just anytime.
I remember it. Yeah. I mean, it was very early in my career, but I did some VB. What was the database they were connecting to back in those days? It must have been very early for MS SQL.
Well, it was MS SQL, a lot of Oracle. Oracle connectivity was the main thing. There was a little bit IBM DB2, but it was those.
Yeah.
There was MySQL and Postgres, all of those hadn't showed up yet. Also, this coincided with the beginning of the browser wars. So, Netscape Navigators comes in 94. By 95, it's really strong. Microsoft wakes up. In Windows 95, there was a very poor Internet Explorer 1, not much. But by, I think, late 95, once, Bill got everybody rallied, Brad Silverberg, who was then running the Windows 95 team, as well as kind of the internet stuff, he had under this guy, Ben Slivka, they've assembled an amazingly strong team that was the IE3 and then IE4 team.
Right.
And
three was when it landed, right? Oh, this is the third version with Microsoft, right?
Yeah,
three was
but
when it landed.
it was amazing what those guys did. And then, around that time, we got, two amazing developers out of Borland. One was Anders Heilsberg. We'll talk about him later.
Never heard of him.
The other one is Peter Kukl. Peter Kukl was a C++ guy at Borland. And the measure that really mattered back in the early 90s, how do you choose a C++ compiler? The speed of the code, the compiler, the optimizations and all of that.
The speed of the build, or you mean what the compiled code?
Like the compiled code. Because
the
performance and
optimizations that are made.
Yeah, totally.
Okay.
Totally.
Yeah. Huh. Interesting.
Because PCs were underpowered. I mean, so performance was everything. And then Anders Heilsberg built Delphi, which was really the first integrated environment, and it was an amazing product. So we worked with those guys. So in those years, I was in charge of the Visual Basic team. We did the Visual Basic tool. We also had part of it, kind of this VBA engine that we were putting into Office, into Excel and Word, and all the macro languages in all of Office. And then when the IE3 team started working, they needed a scripting engine. So Netscape had, initially it was called LiveScript, but as they became kind of buddies with the Java guys and in the everyone but Microsoft crowd, they renamed it to JavaScript. It has nothing to do with the Java language.
There's always a bit of a mystery, to be honest, looking at it. I mean, it was C-like in syntax, I guess, which Java was too. Right. But there was nothing Java-ish about it.
No.
Interesting.
And again, I think the first year at least it was called LiveScript.
Yeah.
And then they kind of got in cahoots with Java and all the other non-Microsoft people who were competing.
And you just dropped an acronym, EBM, everyone but Microsoft. Yeah. This was like because Microsoft was now the giant tiger, this dominant force. Yeah. Everyone else rallied together to.
And basically Microsoft completely owned the desktop.
Yeah.
The one threat was, the internet and Netscape. The other one, Microsoft was really starting to make inroads into the enterprise. So Sun, Oracle, IBM also got all bandied up and probably fanned the flame for the DOJ to go after Microsoft. Not that there weren't good reasons to go. We're not going to get into that deeply. But anyway, so So my team also did the scripting engine for IE, JavaScript and VB script, right?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
this guy, Peter Kugel, one weekend he did JavaScript and another weekend he did VB script.
Wow.
And then we worked on them to put debugging so you could debug in the browser.
Right.
Again, something that Netscape didn't have. So, that's when, we got to work closely with them on JVM and we started building a tool for Java. So there was
wait a minute,
Visual
wait a minute.
J++.
Something's just dropped me because I was starting to code around this time, around the sort of IE3.
Yep.
I think was my first
Yep.
first job, and I remember it was called JScript, not JavaScript,
Yep.
in Microsoft parlance.
Yep.
Was that avoiding this
Yes.
dirty Java
Yes.
term?
Yeah,
Interesting. That makes sense.
yeah.
None of that in the Microsoft stack, right?
Yeah.
Okay, carry on. Sorry.
So that's kind of the landscape. So this is like early '98. We just shipped the version 6 of all these dev tools, and there is this thing about so we've built this great tools to build desktop apps, but this internet thing has happened where most of the code is already running on the server, right? And you have the stateless transition, blah blah blah, and it's a whole different paradigm. The tools that we built are not applicable.
Yeah.
And so what are we going to do? And there was one other new tool that was coming out of Microsoft. There was another team doing Visual InterDev. I don't know if you remember that name.
I do. Yeah. I used it.
Okay.
Yeah, of course.
So this was all about creating internet applications, right? But it was very rudimentary and because just developing for the internet was just evolving.
Right?
It's very nascent.
Well, so wait a minute. The thing I remember doing in Visual InterDev was building, I think, what was called ASP Classic, because it was called Active Server Pages.
Yep.
Because before that, everything was sort of static files being served. And then you started to do this weird thing called, CGI bin was my first.
Yeah, ISAPI.
ASAPI on Windows. But I think it
was CGI something on Unix.
On Unix, yeah. And which I was doing at university, I guess, was where we were using Unix machines. And so it was the first time where it started to get to write this code that would change the stream of HTML that was coming down, over that was becoming more accessible. And Visual InterDev was the first time I was really doing that. Was writing ASP Classic. Yeah.
So really the Visual InterDev. So the tools group then there was like the C++ group, there was VB, there was InterDev, and everyone was doing their own thing and everybody was competitive with the others and especially Visual InterDev and InterDev and the Visual Basic team. And who's going to be, how are we going to do something for the internet? Who's going to do that? And
there was some famous names involved here as well. Was it like Shuchuk and gang?
John Shuchuk was kind of one of the leaders on that. And then Brad Lovering was kind of the main architect on VB. And as things were heating up between the two teams, those two guys decided to just go and I don't know if beers were involved or whatnot, but hash out what is it we should build, right? And they came back and said, we have some initial idea, we think that we should build a tool that can help you, build a complete app that would include kind of the front end with some script and then the back end and ideally, your debugger should go back from the front end to the back end and back, etc. And it was like, wow, that's interesting. But there's a lot of stuff. And then we also had this idea that maybe we want to use this, the Java. So we've also built a Java tool, Visual J++.
Okay.
And Microsoft we made both in the JVM and in the tool a bunch of extensions. So first of all, made it easy to call native code on Windows and to call COM. COM was the object model for Windows. And then in later version, we started adding things like events and other things, kind of high level, language constructs. And so we said, okay, we think Java is probably the best language for this. And then there was the only way we can build all of this together if we, instead of a small team doing InterDev, a little bit bigger team doing Visual Basic, another team doing Java, another team doing C++. The only way we can build all of this stuff that we need to build is we start getting all of this together. And so from the Java and the Java VM, the team who built the Java VM, came the idea of we should build a kind of multi-language runtime.
Wow, okay.
And this became the CLR, the Common Language Runtime.
Yeah.
So there was a group that came out of the JVM team that was starting to build that. There was another team that was kind of building the next generation of ASP. This would become ASP.NET. But those groups were kind of in a separate organization, and we started reaching out to them and say, look, we should get this all together and build this platform, to be able to build internet application, do a really good job at it.
Yeah.
And it was interesting because it was a bunch of people just connecting at this level. At that time, running that group that was doing the new ASP and that runtime was Jay Allard. This is just before Xbox days.
Yeah.
So got with him and said, look, we should really kind of combine forces. So it was a bunch of kind of middle-level folks and architects, just like, okay, how are we need to do something very different here. And it kind of started shaping, and by late '98, we had kind of this notion of, multi-language common runtime, a set of libraries, right, that everything is built on, and that the same libraries would be used by these multiple languages, the J++ and Visual Basic and even C++, and integrate with ASP, all of those things. There was still a lot of moving parts, but we had kind of first very preliminary versions of these working, and Sun had sued Microsoft earlier that year around polluting the Java language. We are misleading. They were claiming that Microsoft was misleading developers to lose its cross-platform purity.
So I don't know a ton about this history. So was Java sort of open source or something? Or
no, Java was not.
How did Microsoft have the right to go and do anything with it?
So as we were rushing, as Microsoft
open source
was rushing,
wasn't a thing then, was it?
Right.
Yeah.
It was clear that to have a good browser, you need to be able to run. At the time, people were thinking that you run both JavaScript but also Java.
Okay.
In the browser, you could run these applets or whatever. That's where because they were working together in the browser. So we'll have Java and JavaScript. In Netscape has already had, I think, a Java VM in there together with Sun. So in like 3 weeks, Bob Maglia was sent inside a deal with Sun Microsystems, which was then the big player. Here's a small aside, okay? If you were a startup in the late 90s, you had to raise $10 million in your A round, which was your seed round, because you had to go and build your own servers.
Yeah,
like
of course,
you were building for
massive
scale.
capex.
So
right?
you had to go buy Sun servers, Sun then with the Premier web server, and they were like, I don't know, $20,000 to $50,000 a pop,
right.
And you had to go buy an Oracle database.
Right.
Again, so before you did anything, you had probably a few $1 million of infrastructure. Which today you just you have the cloud, and you just you just pay as you go. But there you had to be ready for the scale, because you convince your investor that pet.com is going to have
now we just
gazillion customers, and you have to be ready for the scale, right? So that's an aside. So Sun was riding high. By the way, those three companies, Sun, Oracle, and together with Cisco, were hurt the most when the internet, boom crash happened.
Right.
Because of all, there was this huge demand, often unnecessary, and so those companies' stock went, down 90%, around that time. Anyway, coming back.
Well, famously, I worked at Menlo Park campus at Facebook, which was the original Sun Microsystems campus. They actually just turned the sign round, so the back of the sign
still said
Facebook
Sun.
campus is still the Sun Microsystems sign,
and,
as a reminder.
And Sun, I mean, they back in the day, they created some great technologies, including Java. And so Microsoft had a license, licensed Java to use, I think, with Internet Explorer and some other things. I don't remember all the details, but there was some language about adhering to whatever. I'm not going to get into all of that.
Sure.
It wasn't a clear cut, like what Microsoft did with the JVM and the browser. It wasn't a clear cut violation, but they went to, they asked for an injunction. And so This was in 96, IE ships with the JVM, and we continued to add more extension to it. And then we shipped this Visual J++ product that added things like event handlers and stuff like that. That's when they really went and sued, and the judge gave them an injunction and said Microsoft has to stop shipping that product, either modify it or stop shipping it.
So let me just recap. So you folks have gone all in. You've built this sort of common language runtime that seems to span C++, VB, and then you see Java as some sort of middle ground, which is this like powerful, can do graphics, can do things VB can't.
And all the class libraries are written in J++.
And all of the glue code you've written is all in J++. So you've really gone all in on this Java strategy at this point.
And then less than a year into it, we get this injunction, which basically says, either you modify and remove all the impurities, or stop shipping it. And we're like, oh shit, we're building the next developer platform for Microsoft, and we're going to be beholden to Java and what we can or cannot do. So very quickly.
So it wasn't the fact that they'd won that particular, you'd have to remove these impurities. It's the fact you realized you had no control. You were just at the behest of this EBM group almost.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
So this was this was why C# came to be.
Okay.
So we realized we can't use Java. We're not going to go back to C++, right? Too low level. We're not going to go to VB, too high level and not powerful enough. We had to create, a language. Fortunately, we had the best language designer in the world, Anders Hallsberg, who, had done Turbo Pascal and Delphi and actually had done J++, all those extensions. And actually there was a competition. There was another group. This other guy I mentioned, Peter Kugel, and a couple of other guys thought it should be a lower level language, closer to C++, but not quite as open-ended as C++. But after a short bake-off period, it was clear that Anders was the guy. And so he with a couple of other guys were writing the spec, and there was a team implementing it. And I think that within 6 months, we had the first compiler working and all the class library. We built a tool that converted the class libraries from J++ to C#, or at least an initial port.
So in a way, the CLR, which is a very familiar terminology to me, existed before .NET. It was kind of, I think you used it before.
It kind of with .NET.
Yeah.
It came to be with the early, that whole initial vision that was still a little, not completely formed. Okay?
I see.
So, and the story around C# is, so Anders Hallsberg, so C++, right, was in addition to C that added object orientation, right? It was done by this other Danish guy, Arne Straustrup. And Anders Hallsberg, another kind of Danish language guy, he felt that his countryman had gone way too far and made C++ too complicated, like multi-inheritance and all kinds of other things. He was like, I want to use the C syntax, I want to have object orientation, but it's all about making developers as productive as possible while maintaining performance and power. That was kind of his. And then it's craftsmanship. And I don't think there's any. He later did TypeScript and Link and all those things.
Yeah.
So he was clearly the right guy. And so, it kind of slowed us down for a while. And but within 6 months, we had this going, and internally the language was called Cool, C object-oriented language. And then it took about twice as long as building getting the language defined, building the compiler, redoing the class libraries. It took another year to get the name through legal and marketing and all of that. So the things that were starting to come together, there were still a lot squabbling because I was by that time running all the dev tools, so kind of the Visual Studio part and the languages. And there was another team that was doing the CLR and ASP.NET and a few other things.
Okay.
So a word about ASP.NET, there was, a young PM straight out of, I think, Duke, if I recall correctly.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Called Scott Guthrie, and he was kind of, he was one of the young, he was a young PM on ASP.NET. And As we're getting a little further along, the thing that we sent out earlier to developers, and Scott was doing a lot of doing a lot of demos and showing ASP.NET, and he was already wearing his
red t-shirt.
Red t-shirt.
I thought that
so
was
this
a
is
later
slightly,
invention.
this is a little bit orange, not like the red shirt
Yeah.
that Scott. But he was already doing it, and he was just wowed all these developers he was presenting and showing the demos and how do you write code and all of that.
I mean, that is part of his legend, right? Was he was such a good demoer. But I didn't know the t-shirt thing started at the beginning of his. Like he always showed up in a red t-shirt. I thought he kind of adopted
That's my
it.
recollection. Yeah. I don't know.
That's funny.
But and I would say that within a year there, it was clear to everybody that one day we're all going to work for him.
Oh, really? Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah. That it was clear. He was like there was something about it that he was just kind of felt that way.
And for folks that, I assume a lot of fan folks are going to be the audience for this and will be very familiar with who Scott Guthrie is. For those that aren't, Scott Guthrie is now head of cloud and enterprise at Microsoft. He's basically the number 2 after Satcher, I think, most likely, and runs everything on the Azure, .NET. Has a huge organization.
And I would just say the thing that were obvious back then, clearly it was a fantastic demoer, but he could go into the code. He can also step back and really look at strategy. And he was a fantastic presenter and demoer. So all of those things. And they built ASP.NET was really the crown jewel of that whole, at least the initial version of .NET. So at the same time, so all of these, everyone but Microsoft, so Java keeps expanding. They love Java because Java can run on the IBM machine, can run on Oracle, can run on the Sun machines. They loved it. And they started using this as, write once, run everywhere. You don't have to be, locked into Microsoft, right? That was their thing. And then it became clear to them that as you move into the internet, the code is not running on the client, it's running on the server.
Yeah.
So then there was this whole new addition to Java called J2EE, Enterprise Edition, something, I don't remember the acronym. A lot of enterprise stuff, a lot of it, frankly, convoluted and large. And then there was also JSP, which was the ASP.NET competitor.
Okay.
And so Scott's demo, he would say, his canonical demo is you build an e-commerce site. So in ASP.NET and in JSP, a third of the code, because so much of it was built in, and then performance was like 10 times better.
Yeah, okay.
So this was like his canned demo to show why you should use, ASP.NET and .NET versus, Java and JSP and J2EE.
Yeah. And went even further, actually. So I remember with Scott, the old ASP.NET, if I recall correctly, tried to simulate writing VB forms it tried to make it feel like a client-server interaction. You had this thing called like view state or page state or something that was posted back and forth, which eventually became like a horrible idea and everyone hated it.
Right.
But it was Scott who, the rumor goes, took the initiative and on a flight wrote the next version of ASP.NET, which was ASP.NET MVC. I think you'd probably left at this point. And continued to innovate and was a massive factor in them working with open source and supporting Mac like they do now. So just very, in terms of strategic thinking, has done like a fantastic job. Fantastic job over there.
So after we got kind of that initial phase where we kind of, we went through the whole Java to C# transition and we got kind of the pieces in place and we started to see kind of what this whole thing, it was a big thing. So at that point, kind of, it was clear and I kind of, we joined all the tools team, the C++ team, and it felt like the C++ team, it felt like a hostile takeover. They didn't like it at all. In fact, a lot of it was just around the time that Jay Allen started Xbox. And for some reason, a lot of the back-end C++ guys end up going to Xbox, which in terms of Microsoft, maybe it was an opportunity cost miss, but whatever. They had fun going to Xbox. And InterDev and all the tools. So I had under me then all of the kind of languages and the tool, the Visual Studio, which is the freaking biggest app on Windows. And so we were making progress, but it was hard because we were trying to do a complete version 1 with a new common language runtime and the common class libraries and building these internet applications, right? But the expectation was it's going to be version 7 of Visual Studio. So there was this kind of tension. And then This is the time when Bill Gates was very not easy to deal with. This is the time for the DOJ, and Bill was just kind of at the core, he was the son of a lawyer who knew the law as well as anyone else, and he felt like, I built this amazing technology company, and my country is telling me that I did things illegally.
Yeah.
That was kind of his, and I think to some degree in hindsight probably led to Microsoft's strategy in terms of the legal strategy was off. But anyway, and so if we'd have a review, I would check first with his admin if he had called with the lawyers before, because if he had calls with a lawyer before the review, I knew it was going to be a bad meeting, because he would be all pissy and.
So famously, Bill would sort of say to people that that your idea was the stupidest thing he's heard. You've suffered this fate, have you?
So I think first of all, you have to know not to take it personally, but then I think Bill, one of the way he was pushing people's buttons, he wanted to see, especially people he didn't know as well, or people who were new to kind of leadership role.
Yeah.
He wanted to see, like, can you push back? Do you know what you're talking about?
I see.
And initially, I thought, like, when we did the first, VB, it was VB6 review with him, I was like, shit, Microsoft for the first 5 years, from 75 to 80, was all about BASIC. It was making BASIC for all the computers. And he would go, oh, we got BASIC going in 4K. How big is your thing now? It's like, but anyway, after a couple of reviews, I realized that, look, I'm running this team now, and Bill knows some things here, and he can definitely be helpful in kind of a high level of strategy. How does it fit with other things? But he doesn't really know the details, and as long as he feels comfortable that I and the team know the details, and sometimes he'll poke and he'll want to see that we know what. It was fine, and what it took is really pushing back on him a couple of times gently.
Interesting.
And then you gain his kind of. Of course, you can push back on him and look like an idiot, or if you push back when you know what you're saying, and then he kind of, okay, I can trust this guy. It's like, and he kind of lets you. There's always, and then he'll be pissy. Because invariably in the previous review, you told him, oh, we're going to ship our, alpha or beta version on this date with these features. And you'll come back and said, well, we were late by, whatever, X month, and we had to cut, 5 of the 15 features. And he'll get pissy, oh, why are you slipping? And why don't you cut this feature? It's the most important one. And you have to do it, whatever. The other thing that was happening, and this became, so as the enterprise was becoming an important kind of the next frontier for Microsoft, so all of everyone but Java banded up into this J2E thing. And there was a real fear that everyone, and those like especially Oracle and Sun and IBM, were very strong in the enterprise. Microsoft was just coming in. And there was a real fear that they'll get J2E to become the language that everybody is using, or the environment everybody's using to develop these back-end applications. And Microsoft is going to be locked out. And so that's why Bill, this is where Bill really became very invested in what we're doing, aside from all just the web stuff and the internet happening. And so this became his thing. Look, we got to get it out. And they already had a first version. It was crap, but it was out there, and they were making noise around it, and we're just delayed. This thing was taking a long time. So then kind of a couple of things I want to talk about. One was, so they were talking about this J2E everywhere, write it once, it can run anywhere, etc. And we were like, how are we going to combat that? Because we just were running on Windows and in Windows servers, right? Because initially the JVM, later it got ported to Linux.
Much later though, right?
Much later. And so then, there was this beginning of this web services XML, which is a nice tie into Zuplo. This is the first API. And so
we don't see a ton of XML, but
I know, but it was basically okay. So you can build just a straight web server, right? And it's just HTTP and HTML going back and forth with a little bit of script, or you can build some back end logic, whatever it is, and then open it up with an API, which would be a web service, right? An XML. So, and we said, look, this web service XML, you can call it from anywhere, and you can implement it anywhere, and that's way more open than J2E. So we were really starting to promote that. John Shuchak was our kind of ambassador for this, and kind of making that pitch. And in fact, when our come out party was in a PDC in 2001. The opening thing was web services XML was the way you're going to build your application moving forward. This is how you're going to build your logic on the server, and then whether you want to access it from your browser or another application or another backend, that's how it is. In some ways, if you think about it, it was a very, very early and not nearly as granular as kind of the idea of microservices. Just build it as a service, put an API on top of it, right? Again, web service XML, not quite an API, but it's.
I mean, it kind of was.
It was kind of was. So this was. So this was a big thing, and so this is one where I really got into with Bill. This is where I kind of already had kind of some more confidence, I guess. But Bill was looking at this, and he was, and remember, Bill came from the world of DOS, where resources, memory and CPU, everything was very,
scarce.
Scarcity was the thing, and he was saying, I get that you want to do this web services, but why are you shipping the stuff like in plain text, on the wire? And it was like, well, this is how you get interoperability, because you don't have to know where it came from. It's just using XML. And he asked to look at it, and we had a demo, and we showed all the stuff going across, and he was like, this will never work. It's going to be too slow and blah, blah, blah. And that's when I said to him, look, the whole world is working on, optimizing TCP/IP and HTTP and XML and SOAP and all of that, and this is not going to be a problem. And this is our bet, because we have to be open. That's the way strategically we're going to counter the J2E everywhere message. He looked at me. I don't think I convinced him. But in hindsight, I totally was right. But anyway, but he got. I think once I moved it not so much to other people will optimize it, because he just thought it was so inefficient. But it was the openness part.
Right. So the business need versus the implementation details. Yeah. I think it was very API-ish. If I'm honest, I remember one of my first big projects was building an ASMX. I can't remember that stuff. Active Server. I don't know what the MX stood for. I think X was just cool, so you stuck it on the end of everything. Writing sort of a web service API using .NET in about 2004. And as I think about it, a lot of the design thought that went into it, yes, we were using XML and we were using SOAP, which was a weird use of HTTP, and everyone wants to do REST or REST-ish things today. It was really similar. There was a body that was sent, and the response that came back, and
there was
versioning
schema,
was similar.
Right?
Yeah, exactly. It wasn't that different. I think you can claim an API.
That's why I think it was kind of the early incarnation of basically remote calling, exposing services through remote APIs, right?
Yeah.
That's its similarity.
The other thing I want to stop you on though is I never realized it at the time, but now I hear you describe it. Having worked at big companies trying to ship big projects that span multiple teams, what you guys delivered with .NET V1 was actually pretty enormous, right? It was, and as I remember, it was very smooth. It was there was a couple of gaps, but it was a very good, it seemed like a great platform almost from day one.
Yeah, but it took 3.5 years.
Okay, sure. I'm still quite impressed.
So even the days where product cycles were 2 years, 3.5 years, and this is where Bill would get frustrated when we slipped again, and he was like, well, maybe we should just sign up for J2EE and have our own implementation. It was a way to tease and push back on us, right? But the other thing is it was getting so I was running all the tools and languages, and then there was the team that was doing the CLR and all the class libraries and ASP.NET, and there was a lot of collaboration back and forth. But it was another team. The guy was running it, so culturally the teams were different. The tools guys, my team, they knew all about what developers wanted and how to build tools and what does that mean. the other side of it, they all came from the OS team, the systems team, and they were like, we're just building infrastructure. We need to make it efficient and blah blah. They didn't always understand kind of the end user need, because they were really, if you will, the underlying infrastructure for building the apps, right? They were not really customer facing per se, and some other things. And it was just, and the guy who was running it, it was challenging. And so at some point, at the time, I was working for Paul Moretz, who'd been at times kind of the number 3, number 4 guy at Microsoft. He was running all of systems. And like, look, if we want to get this, at the time, we wanted to get it within the next year, within 2000. If we need to get, we have to get it under one organization, whether it's other guy or me or whatever, we need to get this done. So, so we got this done, and so kind of it kind of moved under me. And this is when we formed developer division. This was the first developer division, the first incarnation of developer division. It actually stayed a division. I think to this day, it's still intact as a division. And it was a big organization. So for me, we haven't talked about it, but I mentioned before that in '95 was running a team of 20 engineers. And now after this is like January of 2000, I have a team of like 14 or 1,500 people working under me, building all of this infrastructure, right? There was, there was CLR, there was all this class library, there was like 4 languages, there was the IDE, there was debugging, there was and then testing. This is a time where it was almost 1-to-1, the ratio of developers to testers. And .NET was the first product out of Microsoft where 100% of all the testing was automated. Until then, there was a lot of manual testing.
Wow. Okay. Huh.
And engineering-wise, it was one build, because, and we actually at a time earlier on when we just did the switch to C#, we had cyclical dependencies, because to get anything going, you need the CLR. Parts of the CLR were in the C#.
Right.
Some of the core class libraries were really part of the CLR.
Yeah.
Like the definition of an object and a class and all of those. There was a time where we would go 6 weeks between working builds.
Oh, because just integrating that was just a nightmare.
And then something is broken, you have to go fix it. It's just, it was one huge build. So that actually I ended up spending a bunch of as running this, like, how are we going to fix this thing? It was that was a real problem, and this is like one huge project with lots of critical dependencies, and it wasn't like you couldn't build it as like microservices and everything. I mean, there were even Visual Studio by then had parts that were built in C#, and so it was just
super cyclical. No, I remember thinking about this and knowing that there was some of these dependencies. I knew that some of the Visual Studio was built that I was working on when you're writing in. Actually, I did VB.NET at first just because I'd done some VB.com stuff. Very happy when I switched to C#, but I knew some of that was built using .NET, and so it was multi-layered. It's interesting, and we'll probably come to this talking a little bit about culture, but it's probably worth remembering this was built more around the time where cloud wasn't a thing. A lot of the way you ship software, was still probably like on disks and so on. And MSDN, you remember this when you got these massive bundles
so the big innovation was moving from CDs to DVDs.
Right.
So it was like a 4x reduction in the number. It's still like the first version, I think, was like 5 DVDs. It was enormous.
Or if you were like me, pirated, I'm afraid. Before I got access to it legitimately, I had to get your tools illegally. Confession there. Yeah, no, it was. I mean, but it was a very different time to build software, right?
Totally.
Very different time.
I mean, this is even in Microsoft term was a very long product. The typical, version of Office or the tools was like 2 years. So the first few months you'd spend planning, and now you're planning not 2 years ahead, because 2 years is when you ship it, but the majority of customers will maybe get in 2.5 or 3 years. So you're planning a product that's going to be used 3 years out, right? And then you start implementing it, and you implement, and then you have to do all these quality, and you run, you have milestones, you get it to a certain level of stability, then you add more features, stability, blah, blah, blah. And then in the end, you do like 6 months of testing to really get the quality. Because if you ship it, like you can push an update, overnight.
Gotta wait for Service Pack 1, right? Literally, what's the thing? .NET Service
Yeah.
Pack 1. It was,
It was
exciting.
like 3 or 5 months until
Yeah.
you can get it in Service Pack, right?
Yeah,
So it was
wow.
crazy. So this was, but I think, so when I kind of end up running the whole team, I remember my first review with Bill and Steve, because Steve had then become the CEO. And like on the first slide I had, this is the slide, we're either going to be successful or you're going to fire me. It was basically the leadership team. So I kind of, some people had left and whatever. So the guy who was running all the infrastructure stuff, the CLI and all of that, was a guy called David Treadwell, who was a fantastic development manager. So David Treadwell now runs all of the engineering for Amazon retail.
Okay. Yeah,
I've
heard his name. Yeah.
It's like, I don't know, he's got 8,000 engineers working for him. And when you buy something, the number of machines, the number of things this is all under him. Fantastic guy, just an amazing guy, and some other folks. But anyway, I had a lot of folks. But he got promoted. Before that, he was running one team there, and now was, I think, just the CLR. Now he was running the whole thing, and so just about everybody on that org chart. So it was kind of me and my director, their reports, and everybody was new to their role, like at that level. But everybody was super talented and smart, a lot of very strong technical people.
Yeah.
And I was like, okay, this is it. Either it's going to work and these people we're all going to be, kind of leveling up to this level, and then we're going to be successful, or, just you'll just fire me. That's great. And luckily it worked well. And some amazing people. And the very simplest thing is like, any decisions should be made at the lowest level possible, right?
Right.
Like, I don't want to get involved in anything, frankly, because you guys know so much more about it than I would ever. And it was just, setting up kind of high-level strategy. At that point, it was all about how do we get the freaking thing out as soon as possible. It wasn't like the product definition by then was pretty clear.
Yeah.
It was like, okay, what can we cut, right, out of this version to make it, go out on time. And then we had this enormous last push, which was, so we're done, we're code complete. There was you're not adding feature, you're just working quality. And we went from fixing 4,000 bugs a week. Now there were, like 500 engineers, so it's not that much, right?
Yeah. That's a lot to think about, though, isn't it? 4,000 bugs a week, like.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, you fixing it, and hopefully you're not introducing more bugs but you also started to triage more aggressive what you fix.
Right.
And then after,
meaning some things you're like, we're not going to fix that now because you're
no,
trying to hit
because any bug fix can introduce more.
Yeah.
And so, our by that time our ship date was like January of 22, and we're like through the summer of 21. We're going from like, I think early summer, we were like 4,000 bugs, or maybe even April, I don't remember. And then we get to like September, October, we're like fixing 40 bugs a week. Like to get a bug through there was now a war room, and you had to like, it was, the main thing is just to stabilize the damn thing, and we had some things like the server stuff, like ASP.NET. You had to run these stress tests that would run 2 weeks, right? Because memory leaks and whatnot.
For this, because it's a server, it's not a client
server
machine
has
that's getting restarted.
And then the first really bad security breach happened, which was code red. It was a SQL injection. I don't even remember what it was. It was a Microsoft SQL Server brought a bunch of enterprises to a halt. Nothing like CrowdStrike, but severe. And it was like a wake-up call in Microsoft. And like this is happening.
So this was unrelated to .NET though. This is unrelated to stuff you're working on.
Well, it's only related to .NET because we're like 2 or 3 months from shipping, and we have now stabilized. We're fixing 40 bugs a week.
And then all of a sudden, Microsoft's Eye of Sauron is on security, and we can't have another.
And so we became kind of patient zero, if you will, for that whole Microsoft security thing. So the first thing we did is we went and changed a bunch of default settings. right?
Right.
To less privilege and
Secure
whatever.
by default. Yeah.
And so we started on the run saying, okay, how do we make it more secure? And here are all the different. I don't even remember anymore all the details, but
Stride
all of a
and
sudden,
Dread, is that when that stuff came out?
So, pardon?
Stride and Dread, was that part of the...
No.
They came up with some security framework. I don't know if it was then or... And Stride and Dread were two of the... What do you call it? What that stands for? Something, acronyms that we would follow. Anyway, I'll let you carry on.
No, that was not yet. And so within 2 weeks, we came up with 600 changes. Recall, we're down to fixing 40 bugs a week, and now we're making 600 changes in all over the code base. And, this launch in January, the marketing guys, this is Microsoft, and it was lining up. And by the way, for launch, we had 30 or 40 major customers, ISVs, large enterprise, building apps so they can showcase their apps on our launch. Credibility, all that good stuff. And so there's millions of dollars on this launch date, and I want to say January 12th, but I could be wrong. No, I don't remember anyway. So what do we do, And this is where actually the investment we made is automated testing, And so after we did those tests, and then we're back to fixing maybe more 100 bugs a week and starting, and but we had weeks to. So I got all the QA managers, every team had their QA managers. Okay, guys, you're going to get in the end 2 weeks to test everything. We're not going to do any changes unless there's a real showstopper. That's it. That's all you have. Because they'd already, we were basically on we had the landing gear out already, and then this thing comes out, and so fortunately it worked out okay. And so we did get that, date on time. Anyway,
and the date was it the PDC? That was going to be the launch
No,
event?
the PDC was about a year earlier or 9 months earlier. We had the beta and we gave out, because it was already getting pretty stable. The runtimes were quite stable. So that's where we started getting people to build on it.
Got it.
So the PDC was kind of the first announcement coming out to, all the technical developers, I think it was it must have been the 2001 PDC.
I remember going to a little mirror event in Reading in London at the Microsoft offices down, no, in Reading, not in London, and watching, and I think it was at the same time at the PDC or something.
Yeah. You probably saw John Shuchak talk about web services and XML and all that, and Anders Halsberg demoing C# and all of those guys. Anyway, it was amazing. It was crazy. It was also, by the end of it, I was completely burned out.
I'm not surprised. It is it's just a huge project.
Yeah.
So the fact it took 3.5 years of its time, they probably wouldn't do it like that these days. They'd find ways to do it more incrementally. It's just the nature. We should talk about that shift that we saw briefly, but yeah, I think it was a huge undertaking. So very cool.
It was kind of the challenge was, and I don't know, it'd be interesting to think about how you do it today, but if you're just doing a V1, then it's okay. It doesn't need to be 100. It doesn't need to complete. It doesn't have to work for everybody. We're basically replacing a mature product with a V1, right? And so that was where we felt that the bar had to be really high. And this is, and I think we were successful, as you point out, in that, it was good enough for people to really bet on it.
It was really good. Yeah, no, it was very holistic. I think that's one thing that Microsoft used to obsess about that it doesn't so much anymore, is that they do this giant bang of everything integrated across all of the things.
Yeah.
Whereas now they're much more willing to ship a little bit more piecemeal and let the integration evolve.
Yeah.
So maybe that's one of the cultural...
one of the things we could have shortened, we could have just picked C# and say the first version is just C#, but we had with this huge VB, customer base. Now, I want to add one more thing.
Yeah.
Starting this off, there was a whole question, can we keep it compatible with VB?
Yeah.
And
actually, just quickly, the motivation for that, I remember it being very clear. It was very good to me because I was a VB, I was writing VB code. Was the portability for me was very quick. My learning time moving to this new platform was going to be minimized by the fact I was getting the same language, was the theory anyway.
But your VB6 code will not run on VB.NET.
No, yeah.
And the reason was, in the end, So we had all kinds of technical analysis, and we thought we could make it work. The key thing was in VB, when the last reference to an object went away, the object went away. CLR was this it was lazy garbage collection.
Right.
Right. It will periodically go and clear stuff. And there were finalization, there was some, so there would be VB code that relied on the fact that if the last reference was released, the object was gone.
Right.
And all of a sudden, the CLR, it wasn't gone necessarily.
Right.
And that would create all kinds of problems.
Non-deterministic execution of the finalization.
Exactly. And so I remember that day going to Paul Moritz and Bill Gates and saying, we're not going to be compatible with VB6.
Yeah.
It's going to be, as you say, it's the language, all of that carries forward. But, there are a small but loud minority within the VB community that never forgave Microsoft for breaking compatibility there.
Really? I mean, I think one thing that was talked about, I think there were probably like necessary steps. The same with the weird ASP.NET that emulated forms. That was clearly, in hindsight, a bad idea, but it brought a lot of people along on the journey, and then they switched. I think the VB6 to VB.NET, it was almost worse because you kind of assumed like everything was the same, and then it wasn't, and just getting used to the was it called the MCL, the managed class libraries or something. Getting used to these new libraries like the array lists and all of these types now that work things. You basically were learning a new thing.
That's
anyway.
right. I mean, we felt that bringing over the VB, install base was really important. And in hindsight, I think actually many of them probably over time moved over to C#.
Yeah, I don't think they support VB.NET now. It basically won out. Right?
I think they do, but regardless. But I think we felt it was too big of a risk not to bring them forward.
I suspect it probably did bring some enterprises. All these folks that have been told these forms. Yeah, of course.
And this is so maybe one last thing. When Sun basically got wiped after the 2000 kind of crash, Sun open sourced Java around 2006. Microsoft open sourced, I think, .NET, like when Guthrie was already running, the cloud. I don't know, it was maybe 2017, 18, I don't remember. But when it came out, I sent an email to Guthrie and to Anders Heilsberg and said, gee, could you imagine where Java and .NET would be today if we'd open sourced, in 2002 when we just shipped?
Yeah.
And they were both like, Anders said, yeah, right. We'd be fired on that day at Microsoft because open source back in 2002 was like, it was like a cancer.
Yeah.
That's how Ballmer called open source.
Yeah.
So anyway, it's a bummer because I think at least in those early, in the early 2000s, .NET, ASP.NET was way better than Java. Today, obviously, Java is much more popular. Although .NET still, C# still has a very strong following, primarily with these enterprise developers. Yeah. You don't see hardly any startups use .NET.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah, we don't. Even though a lot of the folks, in the Zuplo have some history with Microsoft and .NET, but we are using Anders language. We're all in on TypeScript, so we can't get away from the Heilsberg, right? There is no escaping that guy, it seems. That's almost been on. We do a fair bit of Go. I think that's it really. There's little bits and bobs of other stuff around, but those are the main languages for us today. Yuval, this was awesome. What a great story of sort of the history of .NET from the guy running DevDiv, and part of the sort of founding genesis of that very famous and like revered division, both internally and to the fandom outside. So thank you for joining us in Studio Z. Make sure to like and subscribe. And of course, leave a comment. Got any questions for Yuval? I'll get answers from him. I have to meet this guy at least every 3 months at our board meetings. So
you're not going to mention that you crossed kind of a certain threshold and you got something for it?
Well, we did cross. Oh yeah, my pie. Yeah, it's in the other room right now. But Yuval's also a baker who took up baking more seriously during the pandemic, and Zuplo just crossed an important revenue threshold, which obviously makes our board and investors very happy. And I said to him, before we hit that number, what do we get in exchange for it? You said you bake us a cake, right? So you've baked and just brought to the studio what's it called?
A pear frangipan.
A pear frangipan, which I'm going to go and enjoy immediately after this recording. We're going to go and have a slice.
Great.
Thanks, Yuval. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Cheers, folks.
Thank you.